So the way that we're structuring tonight's presentation includes looking at what farm managers and staff need to do across some of the core integrity programs, both LPA and NLIS, so the Livestock Production Assurance Program and the National Livestock Identification System, as well as having a bit of a deep dive with the National Vendor Deck. Now, there's a range of tips for people who might be either relatively new to the integrity system or to livestock production, as well as those who might have been in the industry for quite a while now. So, livestock production assurance, what does it mean on farm? So the majority of Australian meat processors require livestock to be sourced from LPA accredited properties. This means that properties have more options when it comes to selling their livestock. So people working on LPA accredited properties commit to carrying out on-farm practices that support the integrity of the entire system. Now, this is verified when the accredited producer or staff sign LPA national vendor decks for livestock movements. Now, the National Vendor Deck is a legal declaration, so it's really important that you understand what you're signing. Now, there are 7 LPA requirements that LPA accreditors properties must abide by, and they are the property risk assessment, safe and responsible animal treatments, stock foods, fodder crops, grain and pasture treatments, preparation for dispatch of livestock, livestock transactions and movements, biosecurity and animal welfare. So what does this mean for you? Well, we'll go through each requirement now in a little bit more detail. So the first element there is the property risk assessment. And why is this important? It's important to minimise the risk of livestock being exposed to sites that are unacceptably contaminated with persistent chemicals, such as dip sites, or physical contaminants, such as power poles and old machinery. Now, risks where animals could come into into contact with physical or chemical contaminants need to be identified and reduced. If not managed, unacceptable levels of these may result in failure to be paid for the livestock, along with possible legal liabilities for resulting costs faced by the supply chain, for example, which may indirectly impact you. Now, it's important to protect our markets by ensuring all livestock are free from these contaminants. So how can you help meet this requirement? You should be aware of the risk assessment and map of the property and ask the owner or your manager to see the map. Report any new risks to ensure that the assessment and map stays updated. Reduce the chance of animals encountering chemicals such as organochlorine pesticides or heavy metals or physical contaminants on farm by avoiding known risk areas when moving or handling stock, for example. If there is a fenced dump, always make sure that the gate is kept closed. Dumps are a common source of contaminants on properties. And you should also record if animals encounter chemicals or physical contaminants during handling. And if a problem does occur, such as animals accessing an area they shouldn't, or a needle breaking off when you're treating an animal, for example, make sure this is reported and recorded. Now, the second requirement of the Livestock Production Assurance Program that we'll focus on is safe and responsible animal treatments. So why is this important? It's important to ensure that animal treatments are administered in a safe and responsible manner that minimises the risk of chemical residues and physical hazards. Animals need to be treated responsibly to protect the reputation of Australian red meat. So how can you help with this requirement? You need to document all animal treatments. It's important to know when animals were treated and why. Buyers will want to know whether the livestock is still within a withholding period or an export slaughter interval prior to purchase. You should also complete a chemical users course. Anyone applying or handling chemicals must be able to demonstrate competency in the storage, handling, preparation, use and disposal of chemicals. Chemical users should hold or be under the supervision of someone who has a current recognised chemical users certificate. It's also a good addition to your resume. You should store chemicals correctly. They must be stored in accordance with the manufacturer's recommendations, and chemicals should be locked away to restrict access to only those that know how to use them. Clean yards and pens where chemicals have been used on livestock to reduce any contamination. You should record when equipment is used and cleaned. You absolutely have to identify animals that have been treated with HGPs or hormonal growth promotants. Some countries and customers will not accept beef products that are treated with HGPs. Records must be kept each time an animal is treated. They also need to be identified with a triangular ear punch. So be extra careful when loading cattle for sale that may have been treated with HGPs. Always double check. And you should also make sure that you are trained and competent to administer animal treatments to ensure the correct dosage and to minimise injury to the animal. So the third requirement of LPA that we'll focus on is around stock foods, fodder crops, grain and pasture treatments. So why is this requirement important? Why is it important to manage stock fodder, grain and pasture? It's important to minimise exposure of livestock to foods containing unacceptable chemical contamination and guarantee livestock are not fed animal products. So these are really important food safety elements of the program, and they can potentially harm the reputation of Australian red meat. So how can you help meet this requirement on farm? Record chemical treatments on stock feed. Agricultural treatments should be recorded and passed on when selling stock. You need to have clear records of what paddocks are sprayed with what. If you use a spray contractor, follow up the spray details with them and then save those records. Record when animals come into contact with chemicals. Record animal movements around the property, and if they come into contact with chemicals, then notify the owner. Complete a chemicals users course. Again, anyone applying or handling chemicals in pasture and cropping must also be able to demonstrate competency in the use and disposal, handling and preparation of chemicals. Store those chemicals correctly. They must be stored in accordance with the manufacturer's recommendations, and you should also make sure that you do not feed RAM products or restricted animal material products. RAM includes meat and bone meal, blood and bone meal, and other animal meals. Now, feeding RAM products is not permitted, and you must ensure that livestock do not have access to any of this feed. And you need to store and dispose of any RAM feed, such as chook or dog food, for example, appropriately. The fourth requirement of LPA that we'll take a look at is around preparation for dispatch of livestock. So why is this really important? It's important to ensure that livestock are fit for transport and minimise the risk of stress and contamination of livestock during both assembly or mustering and yarding and transport. Stressed, sick or injured livestock are an animal welfare concern and may pose a food safety risk. So how can you help meet this requirement on farm? Don't leave things to the last minute. Plan mustering or drafting ahead of time to allow animals time to settle into curfew. Consider classes of livestock and loading densities well before the truck arrives. Handling and yarding, ensure the loading facilities are suitable and the yards are maintained so they are fit for purpose and will not cause injury or stress. Make sure yards are clean and clear with no contaminants, and put chemicals and equipment away. When moving animals into the yards, don't mix animals that are not familiar with each other. You should also record transport details, including the vehicle rego and key times. Only select animals that are fit to travel. Make sure that animals are fit to load, and become familiar with the MLA's Is the Animal Fit to Load guide. And we've got a little integrity insight there on the slide, and we'll share those details with you in the post-webinar email. You should also inspect any vehicles prior to transport to make sure they're clean, and the risk of animals being contaminated or slipping and injuring themselves during transport is reduced. Make sure you observe any pre-consignment curfews. It's important that you do not feed or water livestock destined for slaughter during the minimum curfew period. And for cattle, the curfew is 6 hours, and for sheep and goats, it's 12. The next requirement for LPA that we'll take a look at is around livestock transactions and movements. And why is this requirement important? And that's around correctly completing your livestock transactions and movements. It's to ensure traceability requirements with respect to treatments or exposure to food safety hazards have been fulfilled for all livestock movements. And traceability reduces any potential harm to people, animals, and Australia's red meat reputation if a food safety issue was to occur. How can you help meet this requirement on farm? So it's important that you record all livestock movements. So livestock movements need to be recorded every time an animal moves from one pick to another pick or off the property. The movement should be recorded in the NLIS database. And you should also keep post-breeder tags on hand to make sure that the ingoing and outgoing livestock are correctly identified. Now, we'll go into more detail on animal ID later on in the webinar. You should also fill out a LPA National Vendor Deck, or NVD. We'll also go into a bit more detail about this later on. Remember that the National Vendor Deck, though, is a legal declaration. You should also manage incoming NVDs. Make sure you keep hold of these when livestock come onto the property and ensure that there is a system to do so you don't lose any of those National Vendor Decks. You should also review chemical residue status of animals that are moving. This information will need to be filled out on the NVD as well. And you should certainly record any animals travelling within a withholding period or an export slaughter interval. The next requirement for LPA that we'll take a look at is around biosecurity. So why is it important to maintain good biosecurity practices? And it's all about preventing the spread of infectious disease and invasive pests or weeds. Now, this can help protect the security not only of the business that you work for, but also the industry more broadly. An emergency animal disease outbreak such as foot and mouth would have massive consequences for every person working in the red meat industry. And frontline staff that work with livestock are our best defence in managing the spread of such a disease. So it's important that you be observant, be vigilant, and know what to do if you suspect a problem. Now, how can you help meet this requirement on farm? You need to abide by the on-farm biosecurity plan. Now, each property should have its own biosecurity plan with actions in place to reduce the introduction of diseases, pests and weeds. However, it's not one size fits all. If you move from business to business, the biosecurity plans will differ as they are specific to that particular business. You need to keep records of people, animals, transport entering and leaving where reasonable. Consider displaying signs on fencing and ask visitors to check in and check out when they arrive and leave the property. Keep vehicles and equipment clean. Staff should make sure visitors complete any visitor records the farm might have where reasonable. And if you live on the property, it's important to keep in mind the movement of visitors and vehicles you are bringing onto the property. Should also inspect introduced stock for signs of ill health and disease. Livestock should be inspected regularly. Also visually inspect animals in the days leading up to transport to ensure they are all healthy. And call a vet or animal health officer if any unusual symptoms are found or deaths occur. You should also ensure that animals have a known health status. So obtain an animal health deck when livestock are introduced. And also it's a good idea to provide an animal health declaration to the buyers of stock to prove the animals have a known health status prior to leaving the property. Should also work to minimise the risk of animals straying onto or from the property. Boundary fences should be maintained in good condition and external gates kept closed to ensure livestock from neighbouring properties cannot enter. And it's a good idea to store the phone number for the emergency animal disease hotline that's on your screen in your phone. But just a reminder that biosecurity is not just about exotic animal diseases. It is about how you plan on your property to manage all sort of diseases and pests and weed incursions. And as I said before, it's not a one size fits all, but things like keeping a visitor register are also very helpful in current circumstances where farms are not required to have the check-in, check-out for COVID, but there is an expectation that you're keeping records of visitors to the farm, and that will be aligned with your farm biosecurity plan. Now, the final LPA requirement that we'll take a look at is around animal welfare. So why is this important? Well, animal welfare is extremely important to our customers and consumers all around the world, and it's a key requirement for good production outcomes as well. The inclusion of the national standards and guidelines for animal welfare within the Livestock Production Assurance Program clearly communicates the Australian red meat industry's commitment to providing excellent animal welfare outcomes and provides us with a marketing advantage in a global market. Now, the animal welfare standards and guidelines are written in simple to understand and practical language and clearly define the roles that we all need to play to ensure the animals we are responsible for are receiving the best possible care. So how can you help meet this requirement on farm? You need to make sure that everyone on the farm is familiar with the Australian animal welfare standards and guidelines for the species of livestock that you manage. The person responsible for the livestock needs to be certified, and that they must, and then there must be training for staff, and that must reflect the standards and guidelines. You should also regularly inspect livestock when they are on the property. You need to respond to issues promptly and have procedures for dealing with sick or injured livestock. Check for injuries or issues when loading in particular. Things like ingrown horns, blindness, cancers, old injuries, etc. when loading, and do not load if they are not in a condition to travel. And read through that fit to load guide for more information. And also, at a really practical level, it's really important that we're very mindful when sharing images on social media, for example, that can be misinterpreted. So we've had a bit of a look at each of those 7 requirements for the Livestock Production Assurance Program. We're now going to just have a quick chat about record keeping that aligns with each of those requirements. The first and the most important message here is that there is no perfect formula when it comes to record keeping. In terms of how, and as we've just seen there in the poll, and that's a fairly consistent across a couple of webinars where we've been asking those questions, but some farms use diaries or record books, others use farm management software programs or computer spreadsheets. It's important that all staff, though, are aware that what records need to be kept and what system to use on their property. But regardless of the method, it's important that all relevant management activities are accurately and clearly recorded and that they capture the required information. Now, it's important that all staff are on the same page when it comes to record keeping on farm and whose responsibility it is to complete each aspect of the record keeping. To make it easier, however, Integrity Systems Company has created some record keeping templates which are aligned to the 7 LPA requirements that I've just been through, and they outline all the info that you need to be recording. Now, these are available, as you can see there, at the Integrity Insight on the screen. You can get them from the Integrity Systems Company website just by searching for record keeping template, or you can, if you have the LPA account access, you can order a hard copy through the LPA Service Centre, or you can speak to the manager and ask for a hard copy if you aren't sure what record keeping they might have on farm. You could also contact the ISC customer service team. But red meat businesses and properties are not obliged to use the templates that we've created if they're already capturing the required information in another format or program. But if your farm doesn't currently have a record keeping system, then there is certainly a great place to start and a great resource to ensure that you are capturing what you need to against each of those 7 requirements. Now, a reminder here that LPA records will be reviewed by an auditor, so it's important to make sure that they're accurate and up to date, but don't panic. Audits are about identifying areas for practical on-farm improvement, and we'll talk a little bit about audits later on. Now, we have the next section is just to take a look at the National Livestock Identification System and what that means on farm. Now, NLIS reflects Australia's commitment to biosecurity and food safety and provides a competitive advantage in a global market. NLIS is required to facilitate the traceability of animals in accordance with what's known as the National Traceability and Performance Standards. Now, there's 3 elements that combine as part of the NLIS to enable the lifetime traceability of animals. The first one is that all livestock are identified by an NLIS accredited visual or electronic ear tag or device. The second is that all physical locations are identified by means of a property identification code or a PIC. And the third is that all livestock location data and movements are recorded in the NLIS database. Now, livestock transfers between PICs must be recorded by transferring the tags in that database. As we said earlier in that poll question, the person receiving the livestock is responsible for completing the transfer. All properties need to regularly check their own records against the database to ensure that the transfers are being completed. And completing livestock transfers on the database is also an auditable requirement of LPA. So just have a quick look now at the specifics of animal identification. Now, all animals leaving a property or a PIC must be identified with an NLIS accredited tag or device before moving. If you are moving an animal off its property of birth, tag the animal with an NLIS accredited breeder device. Once an animal has been tagged, the tag should remain with the animal for life. If a tag is lost and the animal is no longer on its property of birth, tag the animal with an NLIS accredited post-breeder device. It's an offence to remove an NLIS tag from an animal and apply another tag. check with your state and territory Department of Agriculture or the NLIS authority for how to deal with non-functioning tags and devices in your jurisdiction. Now, there are different tagging requirements for different species, and also can be slightly different in states as well. NLIS accredited devices for cattle must be an electronic RFID device. This can either be a single ear tag or a rumen bolus, or a visual ear tag in combination. Sheep and goats can only be identified by ear tags or devices and must be tagged with an NLIS accredited tag or device. In all states except Victoria, NLIS accredited devices are either RFID tags or visual tags. In Victoria, all lambs or kids born since the 1st of January 2017 must be fitted with individual RFID tags before they leave their pick of birth. Now, there's lots more information about NLIS accredited devices. You can find that on the Integrity Systems Company website, where you'll find separate lists for cattle, sheep and goats, and we'll provide more information in the post-webinar email. But a little integrity insight there, a little tip is that breeder tags for cattle are white, and for sheep and goats they are yellow or the year of birth colour. Post-breeder tags for cattle are orange and pink for sheep and goats. Another thing about animal identification, don't wait until the truck arrives to find out what tags are missing. Either check the animals in advance or make it a policy to always look for and replace lost tags whenever livestock come through the yards. This also means having a supply of replacement tags on hand, including those post-breeder tags if you have any livestock that are not on or have left and then returned to their place of birth. Sale yards and processors will charge for a replacement tag, which can cost $50 or more per individual animal. Now, if an electronic tag is lost, so therefore the lifetime traceability of that animal has also been lost, on properties that link management tags to NLIS tags and can identify a lost tag, then a replacement tag can be applied and then linked to that lost tag on the NLIS database, and therefore maintaining the lifetime traceability of that particular animal. And you can see the image on the screen there, that's the tag colours for sheep tags. So we've had a bit of a look at LPA and NLIS. Now let's take a look at the National Vendor Declaration and what that actually means on farm. So when animals are transferred between PICs, that's when LPA and NLIS come together through the National Vendor Declaration. Now, NVDs bring together all on-farm assurance, identification and traceability details for animals that make up a consignment, and these form the basis for ensuring a safe and traceable food product. The LPA National Vendor Deck captures food safety information on every animal every time it moves from property to processors or to sale yards. And the National Vendor Deck also provides evidence of livestock history and on-farm practices when transferring livestock through the value chain. Now, the LPA National Vendor Deck needs to be completed by the owner or person responsible for the husbandry of the livestock. All the LPA actions you take on farm directly impact how you fill this form in. It's important to be open and honest about what has happened to the livestock to ensure that traceability and food safety is maintained. It's also important to file and store National Vendor Decks for record keeping and traceability purposes. Now, the biggest tip to stand by what you sell is to fill in every NVD correctly, and the aim is to make sure that every NVD is filled out so it is clear, complete and correct. Now, the questions in Part A of the National Vendor Declaration are often where people need a bit of a hand. These questions are about the animal's history, and this information is crucial for food safety and market access. So the key here is to stay on the safe side. And if in doubt, tick yes. So I'll just highlight a couple of sections from Part A of the National Vendor Deck now. The first one is around the inclusion of electronic devices. Now, for sheep, this is a new addition to version 0720, so the new NVD that became available from the 1st of July last year, where you now can include the number of electronic devices in the consignment. Now, this is to cater for mandatory EID in Victoria, and it's increasing use in other states. Sometimes the consignee and the destination may be different, and have different property identification codes, and it's important that you identify this on the National Vendor Deck. In the consigned to section, you must record the full name and address of the person and or company that the livestock are being consigned to. In some instances, the address given in the consigned to section may be different to the physical location that the livestock are being sent to. Now, the best example of this is when you're transporting livestock to be sold at a sale yard, then the consignee is the livestock agent and the destination is the sale yard location. Another recent inclusion in the new version of the National Vendor Deck is around the destination pick. Now, the integrity insight here is how to find out the destination pick so you can fill this information out accurately. Now, this is compulsory in Western Australia and Tasmania. However, we do encourage everybody in other states to fill in the destination pick. It certainly will help you with filling in your NLIS transfers and maintain traceability when it comes to completing the database. But how to find out the destination pick, ask your agent or buyer before loading at the yards. You can also search in the NLIS database, or if you're using the ENVD, then you can use the search function there. A couple of other questions. The first is around hormonal growth promotants, which I touched on before. On the cattle NVD, you must declare if cattle have ever been treated with HGPs in their lifetime. And don't forget that cattle treated with HGPs must be identified by that triangular ear punch. And on the sheep NVD, there is a question around scabby mouth vaccination. Again, it's important that you check your records and make sure that you declare whether or not those animals have been treated with a scabby mouth vaccination, because in some markets it's actually a requirement, and it's important that the purchasers know that history. The question around the ownership of the animals is also one where producers and people filling in NVDs have a bit of a problem. If you bred the livestock, you need to tick yes. If you purchased one or more animals in that consignment on the truck, you need to tick no, then indicate the most recent date of purchase. And most importantly, you can't tick yes and no for the same question. With things like chemical and veterinary treatments, be mindful of withholding periods for both animal treatments and feed treatments. Again, declare the risk. For all those questions, tick yes or no, not both, and check your records to be sure. As I said earlier, no animal should be fed restricted animal material or RAM products, and this is part of your declaration. And when it comes to the declaration, just a reminder that it is a declaration, it's a legal declaration and a guarantee that you've met those LPA requirements, that the property and the livestock have been managed according to those requirements, and that the NVD is clear, complete and correct, and that the animals have not had access to any of that restricted material. As I said, don't forget the NVD is a legal document and a part of your LPA record keeping, and so therefore can be audited as well. And just to touch on mixed consignments. So if you've got a mixed consignment on the truck and you can divide them into groups at the other end based on their history, then you can do more than one National Vendor Deck, but only as long as you can identify and separate them at the other end. If you can't, then you do need to complete one National Vendor Deck for the full consignment, and pay attention to that question around the ownership and history of those animals and whether they were bred on farm or whether they were bought on, and what their treatments have been, etc. So what are some of our top compliance issues with National Vendor Decks? If we receive NVDs that are not legible, NVDs that are not complete, so questions missed, if they're not signed, if they have both yes or no ticked instead of one or the other to all the questions, whether the NVD form has been photocopied from a hard copy book, or even worse, a sample NVD downloaded from the internet, and absolutely don't use whiteout to correct a mistake on a form. You will notice that the NVD has an individual and unique serial number on each page, so it's important that it's single use only. And if mistakes are made, start the form again. So we also have the new or the ENVD system. So the mobile friendly user centric ENVD system is available to all LPA accredited producers, feedlots and value chain stakeholders to use as their consignment paperwork, including the National Vendor Deck. It's more accurate than paper forms and ensures that the latest version of the NVD is always being used. It reduces time and duplication spent completing your livestock assurance and health declarations. It reduces the cost of storing and retrieving historical consignments for auditing, reporting and administrative purposes. You don't need to wait for new NVD books to arrive, and there's new features and enhancements which are being routinely released in response to feedback. Now, the ENVD is not just a national vendor deck, it's actually a system for completing all your consignment paperwork digitally, including your livestock assurance and your health declarations. Now, there's a multitude of benefits for using the ENVD, and they include the ability to copy information to multiple forms, such as the NFAS or National Feedlot Accreditation Scheme, Meat Standards Australia, and you can use templates to save even more time. The ENVD is very mobile friendly. It's optimised for mobiles and will continue to improve. It's securely stored and always available. You won't need to wait on those books, as I said, or find your handwritten records. Simplifies the LPA audits in that your NVDs will all be in the one place and easy for the auditor and yourself to find, and it can be printed at any time whenever you hit the submit the submit button, which will be available for you to use. Now, in addition, properties will also receive a $30 discount on their LPA accreditation or re-accreditation fees if they choose to go digital with ENVDs at the moment and use the ENVD system to complete their consignment paperwork instead of the National Vendor Deck books. So you might like to think about suggesting the use of the ENVD in your business to help streamline the process for them. So how do you complete an ENVD? So firstly, you need to log in using your livestock production assurance credentials. Now, conscious that a number of people that work on properties have access to the LPA producers login details. However, you might also like to consider discussing with the manager, for example, that you get third-party access. So you're able to access that using your own credentials. You can also use a specific direct link, and we'll share that with you in the post-webinar email as well. Now, there are lots and lots of tips for completing or using the ENVD available. We'll share those with you, and plus we also have a number of, we've got some webinars coming up, which will also be a bit of more of a deep dive into the ENVD if you're interested. So just before I finish up, I did just want to touch on audits. As I said earlier, with audits, don't panic. They're simply about identifying areas for practical on-farm improvement. It is a condition of accreditation that LPA properties agree to participate in the audit process. All LPA accredited properties may be audited. Subjects for auditing are selected at random from the database of all LPA accredited properties, including those just with a few livestock. We do approximately 3,000 audits a year. 2,000 of those would be random audits, and 1,000 of them might be targeted. Now, LPA audits are conducted each year to ensure that the management systems introduced by livestock producers comply with the LPA rules and standards, which are the types of things that we touched on before as we went through each of those different requirements. And the audits act as a check of Australia's red meat integrity system. They can be conducted remotely or on farm. Properties selected for a remote audit upload evidence of their records and documents directly into their LPA account, where they are reviewed by an auditor. Remote audits do not include an on-farm visit. And reviewing on-farm practices against the audit checklist will identify any areas that may need attention before the audit so that it progresses smoothly. And just a reminder that your farm records will be reviewed by an auditor, so it's important to make sure that they're accurate and up to date. Now, we've got a really great audit checklist, which is available on the ISC website, which will also be sent out as part of an audit notification pack. But probably the best tip there is to don't leave it till an audit to get your record keeping in order. It's certainly a good idea to do that well in advance, but you can use these audit checklists and other materials such as all those templates that I talked through before in terms of record keeping to make sure that you're keeping the right records for your property. Now, where can you go to source some more information? I'm conscious we've covered a fair bit of ground tonight. We do have lots of resources available. So the Integrity Systems Company website is a great place to start, where you'll find the details, the checklists around each of those requirements for LPA, the record keeping templates and the like, plenty of FAQs. You can also get some information directly from the LPA Service Centre website as well. We also have a monthly email, which is called Integrity Matters. Now, if you don't receive that at the moment and you'd like to, that's a bit of a one-stop shop for all our latest news. If you want to keep up to date with things that have changed, for example, Integrity Matters is a great piece of information. If you don't receive that, then you can subscribe on the website, or you can also reach out directly to the customer service team, and we'll make sure that we put that subscribe link in the post-webinar email. We're also across all the usual social and digital channels, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, where we have lots of great digital resources and animations, particularly around completing the National Vendor Deck and how to use the ENVD, for example. And just before I finish, just a reminder that the NVD is a declaration. We can't do it for you. Your livestock agent can't and shouldn't be doing it for you, but we're here to help, and we have lots of information available to do that. So